Hello, and thanks for joining me today for this segment of Advanced Strategies in Behavior Change. I'm Candace Southall, and we're going to be talking about the components of the three-term contingency and how it applies to applied behavior analysis. So let's get started. What is reinforcement? Well, reinforcement is the contingent application or removal of a stimulus that results in increased or maintenance of a particular rate of behavior. Once the behavior is admitted, a reinforcer is delivered. Now, what is a stimulus? Well, it's anything. There are assessments to figure out what is going to increase the future occurrence of behavior. Okay? What is contingent? It means the behavior has to happen first. How is it different from a reward? Well, you can only be a reinforcer if future behavior rates increase. So just because you give rewards doesn't mean you've reinforced the behavior. You won't know if your reward is reinforcing until you watch the rates of behavior in the future. Here's an FYI for you. When you reflect on the concept of reinforcement, do not mistakenly associate the terms positive and negative with the concepts good and bad. Rather, keep in mind that these terms refer to the addition or removal of a stimulus or a condition in order to achieve a desired response. It might be helpful to think of positive reinforcement as the reward and negative reinforcement as the relief. But both relief and reward must result as an increase in the probability that the behavior will occur in the future to be reinforcement. So take these considerations to note that a reinforcer is something that increases the likelihood of a behavior. Reinforcement increases both desired and undesired behaviors, and reinforcement may occur without even being planned. And lastly, reinforcement is not effective without meaningful reinforcers delivered effectively. So, how do we identify these reinforcers? We have two types of reinforcers to consider. We have those unconditioned reinforcers, such as water and food, that we are born naturally needing to sustain life. Secondary reinforcers are conditioned, which means they've been paired with primary reinforcers in the past, so they become reinforcing in a sense, in association with the primary reinforcer, or positive outcomes, such as activity reinforcers. Computer time, video game time, TV, and privileges are examples of activity reinforcers. Social reinforcers include such things as praise, hugs, and positive interactions. Material reinforcers obviously depend on the person and the age appropriateness of it, but it could be something like a toy or a game. Now lastly, tokens are reinforcers that can be less disruptive than those immediate activity, social, and material reinforcers, whereas students earn tokens which can be accumulated to later be traded for other reinforcers. Tokens are useful because they're less disruptive, but also because it allows you to teach students that delay for reinforcer, which is more natural in real life settings. So how do we select reinforcement? We have a couple of options. First of all, we could just ask about the stimulus preferences. Using open-ended questions like, what do you like to do in your free time? Or a choice format where you give students a couple of choices to select from. Which would you do a lot of hard work to get? Would you rather get things to do, like art projects, or go to the library, or get something to eat? Surveys are another option when you can have students who may be able to read and comprehend written text, so completing a survey. If a student is unable to complete a survey or answer questions, you might ask significant others. Observing a child is another way to select reinforcement. So you might offer a pre-task choice what would you like to work for, and see if the student can then provide you with that information. You can use visuals for this if the student's unable to communicate verbally. Another option is something called a stimulus preference assessment. In order to conduct this assessment, you would take a large pool of stimuli that might be used as a reinforcer, and then those stimuli are presented to the student systematically to identify preference. So, for example, you might offer an item and note how long it takes for the student to, if they do, take the item and use it. And you can rank items based on how quickly and enthusiastically a student engages with them. You might also put 2 items in front of them and see which item they choose out of the 2, and then continually insert new items to see how often specific items are chosen relative to the others. So a stimulus preference assessment determines which stimuli a person prefers, the relative preference or values of those stimuli, if it's a high preference or a low preference, and the conditions under which preference values may change based on task demand, deprivation states, and the schedule of reinforcement. And we're going to get to those topics here in a little bit. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention about identifying reinforcers, if you have a student who isn't seeing a lot of value in the options you're giving, they're not in a state of deprivation, or perhaps they're satiated with these typical and standard items or activities, you can think about what is a function of the inappropriate behavior. What is the student trying to achieve by engaging in the inappropriate behavior? Perhaps it's attention, escaping a task, having some kind of power control over a situation, achieving some social status, or wanting just attention from adults in the classroom or peers. You can think about if that works for them. I mean, if they will work for that with an inappropriate behavior, and you're going to stop reinforcing the inappropriate behavior, and you say, what can I have my student earn for this new behavior I'm teaching? Well, if they were engaging in behavior to obtain escape, for example, by having a tantrum, perhaps they will engage in some work in order to escape a task or to get a break card. So you could also think about those function-based reinforcers for those students that are difficult to find something that they will truly want to work for. So with that said about reinforcement, and that's just a basic overview of reinforcement, we need to talk a little bit about differential reinforcement. According to Cooper, Heron, and Heward, 2020, differential reinforcement entails reinforcing one behavior, or what we might call a response class. If a behavior is a response, then a response class is a group of behaviors that all achieve the same outcome. They all maintained by the same reinforcer. So differential reinforcement entails reinforcing one response class and withholding reinforcement for another response class or behavior. In a nutshell, differential reinforcement consists of providing reinforcement contingent on a behavior other than the interfering behavior, or the interfering behavior occurring at a lower rate, while at the same time withholding reinforcement for the problem behavior or the interfering behavior. It can be implemented with both positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. It's important to note that differential reinforcement does not involve extended interruptions of ongoing activities, such as timeout. You don't have to have contingent removal of positive reinforcers, such as response cost. And it avoids presentation of aversive stimuli or punishment. Therefore, differential reinforcement is considered the least intrusive of all behavior interventions. So it's very popular. There are 4 primary types of differential reinforcement that we can discuss here, but they all fall under the same basic concept that I've just explained. First, we have differential reinforcement of other behaviors. I like to think of this one as the O being actually a 0 and perhaps saying differential reinforcement of 0 rates of behavior. Essentially, we want to decrease the frequency of a certain behavior, and we want to reinforce all behaviors besides the behavior that's interfering. So under a differential reinforcement of other behaviors system, the teacher or practitioner would deliver reinforcement contingent on the interfering behavior not occurring through intervals of time or specific moments of time. Differential reinforcement of other behavior has been demonstrated to be effective on a wide range of behaviors, including disruptive classroom behavior, stereotypic vocalizations, self-injurious behavior. It has been used to reduce biting, chewing. To implement a DRO, first you need to set intervals that ensure frequent reinforcement. So taking some data anecdotally to determine how long a student can actually go without the interfering behavior occurring would be a good starting point, because we want the student to be successful and earn reinforcement. It's important that you do not inadvertently reinforce the undesirable behavior. And over time, you need to increase your expectations of how long the student must go without engaging in the interfering behavior before receiving reinforcement. Another type of differential reinforcement is DRL. Now, this is differential reinforcement of lower rates of behavior. It is very similar to DRO, but occasionally you have a behavior that you don't want to completely extinguish. You just want it to occur less often. So in the case of a DRL, you're not expecting the student to go a certain amount of time without engaging in the behavior, but instead, you're setting a limit of how many times a student can engage in the behavior to still achieve the reinforcement. Differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors is pretty simple to understand. The behavior that is impossible to occur simultaneously with the interfering behavior is an incompatible behavior. So differential reinforcement of an incompatible behavior is contingent application of the reinforcer upon engaging in a behavior that is incompatible with the interfering behavior. For example, a student who uses his fingers to shred the threads in his clothing or ripping his clothing might be reinforced by putting his hands in his pockets, because he cannot rip his shirt if his hands are in his pocket. But overall, differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors is a popular differential reinforcement that is simple to implement. Essentially, once you've identified the interfering behavior and the function that is maintaining that behavior, whether it be escape or avoidance or attention, or perhaps sensory stimulation, a more desirable behavior or an alternative behavior is identified and contingent reinforcement is applied when the student engages in the alternative behavior. One thing to consider is that when the student engages in the alternative behavior, the student receives a function-based reinforcer. For example, if a student is engaging in tantruming to avoid difficult work, instead, you could ensure the student continues to have work when tantruming, but when the student asks for a break using an acceptable form of communication, the student is then given a break. Differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. The guidelines for implementing DRA include selecting that alternative behavior and selecting potent reinforcers and delivering them contingently upon emitting the alternative behavior. This has to be done immediately and consistently. And in addition, you need to withhold reinforcement for the problem or interfering behavior. Well, that concludes our segment on reinforcement. Moving on, we're going to look at the three-term contingency. As you know, antecedent, behavior, and consequence is our three-term contingency. The consequence, of course, would include reinforcement, but it would also include punishment, which we will not be depending on since we are focusing on positive behavior supports. However, the antecedent is something that I would like for you to develop a better understanding of so that we can help modify our environment so that students can be more successful. Set them up for success. So stay tuned. I'll see you there.